Our podcast, The Enemy of Mankind, mainly focuses on whether corporations should be held responsible for any kind of human rights violations that happen overseas, and also brings into question the concept of the American Supreme Court being seen or considered the Supreme Court of the world. The podcast opens with the case of Dolly Veronica, which kickstarted the idea of our court system being considered or seen in the near future the Supreme Court of the world. Dolly wanted justice for her brother, whom she watched get tortured, beaten, and killed in front of her at an early age. However, she was unable to obtain justice in Paraguay, which was the country she resided in, due to major cases of corruption. She had to wait until years later, when she moved to the United States and was able to track down the one responsible for the death of her brother, who was now also living in the United States as well. After receiving help from lawyers and getting the person into court, they were able to use the Alien Torch statue during their trial, which was able to get justice for her brother and a settlement of $10 million for her family. However, this use of the Alien Torch statue, which was originally made for pirates, opened up a window for lawyers across the United States to file against foreign corporations. This, of course, caused major controversy in Western democracies, since it gave the American courts more power and reach into foreign sovereignties, while also being seen as a violation of international law. However, on the other hand, it prevented corporations from committing brutal crimes, and it has allowed for accountability to be placed on what was seen as untouchable entities. Which brings us back to the original question that this podcast asked. Should the American court system be seen as the Supreme Court of the world, or is such an idea considered impossible?
This podcast shows interpersonal communication in action through the interactions between victims, lawyers, judges, and family members. According to Interplay, interpersonal communication is transactional, meaning messages are created and interpreted simultaneously. In this podcast, survivors share their stories while lawyers respond with empathy, guidance, and support, creating a back and forth process that shapes how cases move forward. The emotional interviews also connect to the basic needs communication fulfills, described in Chapter 1, especially the identity, social, and instrumental needs. Victims tell their stories not only to seek justice, but also to express who they are and reclaim their identity after trauma. Their communication with advocates helps build relationships and a sense of human connection, which matches the definition of interpersonal communication as meaningful and personal. Additionally, this podcast demonstrates communication competence from Chapter 2 in the way that lawyers must be both effective and appropriate in how they speak with clients who have experienced severe abuse. This requires empathy, listening skills, and adapting to the emotional needs of the victims. The host also model competent communication by clearly explaining complex legal ideas to listeners in a way that is more understandable and respectful. Overall, the episode highlights how interpersonal communication shapes the legal process and creates emotional connection through shared narratives and active listening.
The cultural framework of this podcast explores how the U.S. courts apply the Alien Tort Statute to international human rights cases. This reflects cultural values of justice, sovereignty, and global responsibility, showing how American legal culture interacts with global norms. From a co-culture perspective, we see that victims' families, lawyers, and activists represent co-cultures, and each group uses communication strategies to assert identity and legitimacy within a dominant legal system. The podcast uses Adler's culture and co-culture strategies to get its message across. For example, self-monitoring. Lawyers and advocates carefully adjusted their language to fit the courtroom setting, showing awareness of how their words would be perceived. For empathy, the victims' families and human rights lawyers use storytelling to humanize their experiences, practicing empathy to bridge the cultural gaps between the Paraguayan victims, and the U.S. legal audience. For adaptability, the podcast highlights just how speakers shifted strategies depending on whether or not they were addressing the judges, public, or each other. And the episode demonstrates Adler's point that competent communication in intercultural and co-cultural contexts requires empathy, adaptability, and identity management. By blending professional legal discourse with moral storytelling, the speakers maintain credibility while building trust across cultural divides. Ultimately, there are just too many factors to consider when debating whether or not the U.S. court should become the world court, especially when it comes to all of the diverse countries who have, all of the diverse cultures of the distinctly different countries. It would be very challenging to change another country's way of living and their culture without taking away their culture entirely from them. So realistically, I'm not sure how one country could rule over another without the other country putting up a fight.
Power is very evidently shown throughout the podcast, as we hear about Dolly's story and her time growing up in Paraguay, to human rights lawyers trying to go for corporations, such as Shell Gas Company, regarding the Nigerian government's hunger for power and wealth. In Dolly's case, we can see how during this time of the Red Scare, countries were heavily influenced by other communist countries and its thirst for power over its people. Southern American countries were especially influenced, such as Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil, and many more, with Chile being the main. Described as being the spider for the web of communist and socialist ideology to the Southern American countries. These countries had a more higher power mindset to where they wanted their people to accept power and equality, which is reflected in hierarchical structures and a deference to authority, while the people obviously wanted a low power culture that minimizes that power and promotes equality. The same goes for the story of Ken Wiwa's father and his time during the Nigerian government's reign on petroleum. The government's greed wanted that oil that was beneath their land, so they called upon Shell to help them. General Sani Abacha, who ruled Nigeria as head of state during the time, used coercive power, which is the ability to punish or threaten negative consequences for non-compliance, and soon later moved to absolute power, which placed his government above the jurisdiction of the courts, giving him absolute power and the right to detain individuals without trial. Both Dolly and Ken Wiwa's experiences and their government/politics generated power, took power, and spread fear to keep that said power. The podcast really shows how much of a problem it is when these political leaders take power, using these tactics and embedding these ideologies. It creates fear within their countries.
As we reached the end of our analysis of Enemy of Mankind, our group brought together our perspectives and we formed an agreement. To wrap up our group's discussion, our overall position is that the idea sounds promising in theory, but it breaks down once you consider the realities of culture, politics, and communication across nations. As a team, we agreed that the podcast raises an important question about access to justice, especially for people whose own countries fail to protect them. In that sense, the idea of a global justice system is appealing and even necessary. But when we looked at the topic through the lens of interpersonal communication and cultural differences, we came to a shared conclusion. The U.S. Supreme Court cannot realistically or fairly function as a court of the world. One major point our group discussed is that giving the United States that level of authority would create significant political tension and overlook the cultural values of other nations. Just as we would not any other country imposing its legal standards on us, other nations would not want the U.S. making their legal decisions either. Another perspective in the group pointed out the limits of the Alien Tort Statute. While it appears to offer a pathway to international justice, in practice it's restricted, inconsistent, and not strong enough to serve as a true global system. Without an agreed-upon international structure, it ends up feeling more symbolic than functional. Others in the group emphasize that the difference in laws, norms, and cultures across nations make a unified global court nearly impossible. The idea may look good on paper, but it wouldn't last long-term unless a completely new worldwide justice system was created, and all the countries willingly adopted and followed it. Another viewpoint highlighted the communication challenges, so different interpretations of justice, conflicting viewpoints, and varying cultural expectations. These differences would lead to a constant clash and strain relationships between nations, making the system unworkable. In the end, I agree with them as well, because I do think that it's good to help those who wouldn't receive justice in their nations, but I don't think it's realistic or fair that we would impose our ways and politics on other nations. So I think it's best that we can just help as many as we can who do come through our criminal justice system. So as a group, our final position is that while a global justice system could be beneficial, it should not be run by the United States nor modeled after the U.S. Supreme Court. There are too many cultural and political barriers for that to function fairly. If anything, the world will need a collaborative, internationally built justice structure, not one centered around a single country. Overall, the podcast encouraged us to think about justice beyond borders, but it didn't change our belief that any true global court must be inclusive, culturally aware, and agreed upon by all nations. Otherwise, it would risk causing more conflict than resolution.